Live by the sword, die by the sword. Here are 13 killers who got a taste of what they served. Daniel Barboza. On 13th November 1994, Daniel Camargo Barboza was stabbed to death in his prison cell by a new inmate. Barboza was a prolific Colombian serial killer and sex offender, believed to have and murdered at least 72 girls in Colombia and Ecuador during the 1970s and 1980s. He was stabbed 8 times in prison. James Bulger. The 89-year-old Boston crime boss, who was serving 2 consecutive life sentences for 11 murders, was beaten to death in his prison cell in 2018. The murder was planned as soon as Bulger arrived at the West Virginia prison and was carried out by inmates Fotios, Freddie Gayus, Paul DeCologero, and Sean McKinnon. Gerard Schaefer. In the most brutal of deaths, Gerard John Schaefer, a convicted necrophilic double murderer, abductor, and suspected serial killer, was stabbed in his prison cell on December 3, 1995. He had been attacked by fellow inmate Vincent Faustino Rivera, who stabbed him over 40 times and slashed his throat. Jeffrey Dahmer. According to Christopher Scarver, God sent him to kill Jeffrey Dahmer, and he complied. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver while on cleaning duty at the Columbia Correctional Institute in Portage, Wisconsin. Dahmer was found in a pool of blood with massive head injuries. Roger Kibe. Kibe was a convicted serial killer known for stalking freeways south of Sacramento, earning him the name the I-5 Strangler. He was found unresponsive in his prison cell. His cellmate, Jason Budrow, a self-avowed Satanist serving a life sentence for murder, was present at the scene and later charged with first-degree murder. Sidonio Teixeira. On June 20, 2016, 59-year-old Sidonio Teixeira, a convicted child killer, was beaten to death by fellow inmate Castigador. Teixeira was serving a life sentence for murdering his 3-year-old daughter and attempting to kill his 9-year-old son. Castigador, a former hitman, used a rock wrapped in a sock to deliver fatal blows to Teixeira's head. Artur Kitaev. Kitaev, known as the last sex maniac of the USSR, murdered 6 women and girls in the Smolensk Oblast between 1990 and 1992. He was initially sentenced to death, but his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. On 29 September 2019, he was murdered by his prison cellmate, Dustmarod Ilyosov. Laron Williams. American serial killer Laron Williams. Williams was serving time for the murder of a prostitute and was suspected of at least 2 similar killings. He had escaped from prison and murdered a police officer and a priest in 1981, for which he received 2 death sentences. Jose Antonio Rodriguez. The 44-year-old Jose Antonio Rodriguez Vega, known as El Mataviejas or the Old Lady Killer, was stabbed to death by 2 fellow inmates. Rodriguez Vega was a prolific Spanish serial killer who raped and murdered at least 16 elderly women, ranging in age from 61 to 93, in Santander, Cantabria, between 1987 and 1988. Lee Roy Martin. The Gaffney Strangler, Lee Roy Martin, was stabbed to death by fellow inmate Kenneth Rumsey at the Central Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. Martin was a serial killer and rapist who targeted young women in Cherokee County, South Carolina, between 1967 and 1968. He murdered 4 women. Charles Schmid. On March 20th, 1975, 32-year-old Charles Schmid, known as the Pied Piper of Tucson, was stabbed and slashed repeatedly by fellow inmates in his prison dormitory. He sustained between 14 and 20 wounds, including a stabbed eye, a punctured lung, and a severed ureter, and ultimately lost an eye and a kidney. Donald Harvey. March 28, 2017, saw 64-year-old Donald Harvey, known as the Angel of Death, found savagely beaten in his prison cell at the Toledo Correctional Institution in Ohio. He died from his injuries 2 days later, on March 30th. Fellow inmate James Elliott was charged with and later pleaded guilty to Harvey's murder. Richard Loeb. Richard Loeb was attacked and killed by fellow inmate James Day in the shower room of the Stateville Penitentiary. Day used a straight razor to slash Loeb's throat from behind and inflict over 50 wounds. Loeb and his partner in crime, Nathan, had been convicted of the 1924 kidnapping and murder of 14-year-old Bobby Franks in Chicago.